now. So a very, very warm welcome to everyone to tonight's talk by Professor Eliyana Adler. And we're holding the talk tonight to mark Yom HaShoah, more specifically to mark the 78th anniversary of the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which of course was the heroic resistance staged by Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto in April 1943, which held off the Nazis for 28 days. I am Shirley Gilbert. I'm Professor of Modern Jewish History at UCL, and I'm also the Academic Director of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, which was established in memory of the late British historian. And I'd like to extend a special welcome tonight to Esther Gilbert, Sir Martin's widow, who's joined us, who's finally back in the UK after 5 months abroad. So welcome, Esther. Nice to have you here. Sir Martin, of course, in addition to being the official biographer of Sir Winston Churchill, also published 88 books on a wide range of topics, including influential and widely read accounts of the 20th century, the First and Second World Wars, the Holocaust, the history of Israel, and the history of the modern Jewish experience. He also published a series of pioneering historical atlases. Sir Martin was not only a master chronicler of the modern world, but really had a remarkable ability to bring history alive to his audiences. And so fittingly, our aim at the Centre is to bring the best historical research to a broad non-academic public and to make history accessible and exciting. We offer a really wide range of programs across the year on the subject Sir Martin spent his life exploring, so please do join our mailing list. I'll put a link in the chat just after I finish this introduction so that we can let you know about forthcoming events. And tonight, I'm really delighted to welcome Eliyana Adler, who is Associate Professor in History and Jewish Studies at Pennsylvania State University, to talk to us about her wonderful and important new book on a little-known aspect of Holocaust history. Eliyana's research in general focuses on the modern Jewish experience in Eastern Europe. She's written particularly about the history of education, religion, gender studies, and of course, the Holocaust. Her first book was titled In Her Hands, The Education of Jewish Girls in Tsarist Russia. And it traced the emergence and development of formal schooling for Jewish girls in pre-revolutionary Russia. Her most recent book, and the one she's going to be talking to us about this evening, is titled Survival on the Margins, and it chronicles the experiences of Polish Jews who survived World War II in the unoccupied regions of the Soviet Union. And as I mentioned when we were chatting before this started, I know that there are a few of you here today who lived through that experience yourselves, or who had family members. I should say my own grandparents actually are part of that story. And so we're really, really interested to hear, Eliyana, what you have to say. Eliyana will speak for about 45 minutes. After that, we'll open up the floor for questions and comments. And you can post your comments to me in the chat if you would like, and I can convey them, or you will also have the opportunity to ask them yourselves if you would prefer that. So without any further ado, let me turn to you, Eliyana. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm pleased to be with you on Zoom, if not in person today, and to be sharing my recent research about what to me is a very important topic, and I hope that you will agree. So, trying to advance my slide here. Here we are. In 2018, the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills took a trip to Berlin. Amidst the shopping and the drinking and the socializing, they all stopped in at the Holocaust Memorial there, where one member of the group tearfully told the others that her father had been in, and I quote, a concentration camp in Siberia. The other members of the group didn't really have any comments on that. They went on with the rest of their activities, but the fans of the show immediately started sending out questions and queries about how that was possible, questioning the authority of her experience, if there were concentration camps in Siberia, what the war was, what the Holocaust was. It led to sort of a surprising and interesting conversation, which to me encapsulates the 2 points that I try and make in the book, and that I'm really going to focus on today, which are about both the history and the memory of this particular experience of the war. And I will spend most of our time today talking about the history, and I've divided it into these sections of flight, Sovietization, deportation, amnesty, repatriation, and rebuilding. There's a great deal that I won't be able to fit in today. There's just so much to say about these experiences, but I've tried to give the bare bones experience. And then at the end, to return to the questions of memory, which I think are particularly appropriate for this being Yom HaShoah. So this map gives us the wartime trajectory of one family, the Elsners, who, as you can see, began the war in Krakow. They traveled through Lvov, which had become Lvov and is now Lviv, into the Arctic. They went all the way up north, from there to Western Siberia, into what is now Uzbekistan, and to the Caucasus before returning to post-war Poland, to Stettin, which is now Szczecin. This is just one example of each family has a different map, but it gives you a sense, for those of you who aren't so familiar with this experience, of just the wide range, the scope of this experience, that people traveled to different worlds, places they had probably couldn't have even found on a map before the war, in the course of just trying to survive and get through the war. And to me, a lot of those stops along the way and the places they went are about individual decisions, collective decisions, family decisions, and individual decisions. And so I make my divisions here based on different choices along the way. So to begin with, flight. It is well known that the Second World War began on September 1st, 1939, with the massive German invasion of Poland. The ruthless bombing campaign, the enormous ground offensive quickly overwhelmed Poland's defenses. All Polish citizens faced danger and many died. 2 weeks later, the Soviets invaded from the east, and this was the end of the Second Polish Republic, and a terrifying time for families, for individuals, people who were separated because of summer camps, because of schools, because of work, had to figure out if they could come back together. Some were mobilized in the military, some were taken captive. It was a very disorienting and dangerous time for all Polish citizens. But particularly for Polish Jews, there was a decision point here, which was particularly as the Soviets established slowly their occupation in what had been Eastern Poland, and the Germans did so in what had been Western Poland. The question was, should they stay where they were, or should they try to relocate? And this was particularly an important question for those under German occupation. No one knew, no one, including Adolf Hitler, knew in 1939 what would happen in the next few years. No one could imagine the genocide and aspects of it yet to develop. But Polish Jews had access to world news. They knew in 1939 about the Nuremberg laws. They knew about Kristallnacht. They knew quite well about the expulsion of Polish Jews from Germany, from the Reich, into Polish territory, and all of the cruelty entailed in that experience. So it was not welcome news that the Germans had taken over their part of the country, and they had to decide, should they stay or should they try and take their chances on the other side? Should they become refugees under Soviet occupation? Obviously, neither was ideal, but they did actually have a choice at that moment. It is, I think, in retrospect, somewhat surprising that more didn't leave, didn't escape from the Germans when they could. But of course, we know that they couldn't have known what would happen in the future. And also that it is human nature to stay at home in our communities, in our families. We're more comfortable. We have the resources, social, financial, and otherwise, to take care of ourselves and our loved ones. And so we don't actually know the exact number of those who fled. The highest numbers that have been offered are about 500,000. Some people say it's as low as 200,000. We don't know because no one was keeping count, because it was flight. That's the nature of flight. But it was a difficult choice and a difficult route. It was the middle of a war. There were all sorts of dangers. As it got colder into the winter, people were still making these decisions, but the borders were beginning to close on both sides. It became more dangerous to pass, both because of the territory and because of the guards. But still, people were still deciding. Even you can see from this diary entry cited here, as late as the end of November, the Sharakoviak family was still considering, did it make sense to stay or go in Łódź? It was, of course, easiest for younger people, for people who had fewer people depending on them to go. There's all sorts of different stories of families deciding jointly to send their younger members all together or to send all the men all together. There's been an assumption often in history writing that it was the communists or the socialists, the left-wing Polish Jews who left because they thought they would be more comfortable under the Soviets. But there were also plenty of Orthodox families, of Zionist individuals, of Zionist families, of Bundists who knew that they would be actually in danger in Soviet territory, but still felt that it would be better than under the Germans. Family separation was difficult, even for those who made the trek, and many turned out coming back. Because life in the new Soviet territories was also very difficult. For Stalin, the Molotov-Ribbentrop non-aggression treaty signed with Germany in August of 1939 was a fantastic opportunity to expand Soviet hegemony. The revolution had proceeded in bits and starts over the past 20 years, and they finally had a formula. They finally were getting somewhere. They knew what it was to be a new Bolshevik nation, and they wanted to export that knowledge. So in the beginning of September 1939, a process of rapid Sovietization began in the formerly Polish territories. And this included, it began with arrests of the wealthy, of bankers, of landowners, of property owners, of politicians, of clergy, of police officers, soldiers, members of any political party, anyone else deemed to be potentially dangerous to the regime. That was in September. In October, the borders were set and preparations for elections began. And I should say elections are in quotations here. These are Soviet-style elections, meaning that there was a slate of chosen candidates. Everyone had to vote under pain of punishment, and they had to vote for that one slate. The newly elected delegates met in early November, and their first act of business was to request annexation by the USSR. So overnight, Polish citizens became Soviet citizens. They received new passports. They lost their property. Along with this transformation of the economy, everything else in Polish society was changed. Education, culture, religion, everything that we know about Soviet society was brought in just overnight, and in so many radical ways that were difficult for everyone in Eastern Polish territories, which became Western Belarus and Western Ukraine, new republics of the Soviet Union. So for all of these residents, the speed and severity of the transformation was traumatic. Many were impoverished overnight. The only way to survive was by selling their belongings on the black market, which in itself could lead to arrest. The photograph that I'm showing here is of a man who is in Lvov walking to the black market carrying kerosene lamps. And this is the last photograph that his sister ever received of him. So they don't know exactly what happened to Hershik Stapler. The refugee population faced all of these same obstacles with the addition of lacking stable housing and status. Many slept in shuttered synagogues. They had no legal papers. They searched for work and they scrounged for food. It was during the winter of 1940, one of the coldest on record, that many elected to return to their homes under German occupation rather than live in the streets under Soviet occupation. However, in addition to the trials faced by residents and refugees alike, Soviet annexation also brought some advantages. In interwar Poland, strict quotas had made it almost impossible for Jews to advance in education and the professions. The USSR had no such limits. Jews could go to high school and even higher education, and many young people took advantage of these unprecedented opportunities. In the arts and culture as well, for those willing to toe the line and conform to Soviet standards, professional advancement and funding were available on previously unimaginable levels. Some Yiddish writers, actors, other artists were able to earn a steady living for the first time in their lives doing their actual craft. Of course, they had to also learn to stay ahead of the ever-changing ideological demands. Life under the Soviets was challenging, but over time, they got used to the expectations. They awaited the end of the war and hoped to return to their old lives, the refugees as well as the residents. But that was not to be the case. The Soviet state, as it turned out, had not forgotten the refugees. Their first priority had been to deal with the residents, all of those people who lived before the war in Eastern Poland. But with the implementation of Sovietization, the state now had time by early 1940 to tackle the problem of the refugees. So there were some couple 100,000, possibly 300,000 refugees from Western Poland, almost all of them Jewish. The first effort to deal with them had been in the fall, actually, when they were offered work in the Soviet interior. However, few of them accepted. They didn't want to leave their comfort zone and their compatriots, people who spoke their language and who they had so much in common with. And in addition to that, the work in the interior turned out to be under terrible conditions. And so the handful of Polish Jews who signed up to do that often turned out either leaving illegally or sending letters to their families and friends saying, don't do it, it's not worth it, it's terrible here. So by the spring of 1940, the Soviets were concerned about this unregulated group of refugees. They felt that they were triggering greater black market trade, and they issued an ultimatum. The refugees had the choice either of registering for return to their homes under German occupation or accepting Soviet citizenship, although their passports would require them to move away from the border areas. So this is another choice, another point that turned out to be a very important one. During this period, when the Germans and the Soviets were getting along, there was mail going back and forth. So Polish Jewish refugees in Soviet territory knew from their relatives and friends and peers about ghettoization. They knew what the Germans had done, and from their perspective, it didn't sound that terrible. Okay, all the Jews live together. At least they're together. At least they're not being sent someplace they don't even know the language. They don't recognize the people. They don't know what to do. Additionally, many of the refugees were afraid to take Soviet citizenship because they were afraid that they wouldn't be able to return to Poland after the war. Thus, the majority of the refugees registered to return to their homes in German-occupied Poland. They could not have known that the ultimatum was in fact a test. The German authorities would never have allowed thousands more Jews to return to their lands. They were already trying to get rid of the Jews they had. By signaling their dislike for the USSR, however, the refugees had shown themselves to be unreliable and undeserving, and therefore required punishment or at least re-education. The following June, this is 1940, in the middle of the night, over the course of 2 days, NKVD agents, and that's the precursor of the KGB, that's the security services, arrived at the dwellings of all of the refugees who had registered for return They were told that it was time to go. They were given 15 minutes to pack their belongings. They were taken under guard to train stations, loaded into freight wagons. It was stifling inside the crowded wagons. Most people didn't have sufficient food, let alone water. They were disoriented, they were frightened, but at least they thought they were going home. However, when the trains left the stations, they traveled east instead of west. It took many of the refugees a while to figure this out. They didn't recognize the station names. Maybe they were taking a different route. It took them a while to realize what was happening. But at a certain point, everyone in their memoirs and interviews about this experiences describes that moment when they knew that they were going to the Gulag, to labor camps in Siberia. In some ways, they should not have been entirely surprised by this development, because before their deportation in June of 1940, there had been a series of other deportations of Polish citizens, but they were in other categories. Most of those other categories didn't include Jews. And this group of refugees, although they saw people they know being arrested for a series of crimes, being deported, they somehow didn't think it would come to this. In the end, most of the refugees did not actually end up either in Siberia or in labor camps. Most of them were sent to the Arctic, to the Urals, or to northern Kazakhstan. What is today Kazakhstan? It was then the Soviet Socialist Republic, Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic. They were placed there in what the Soviets termed special settlements, which was a branch of the Gulag, but one that was not as harsh as labor camps. These were essentially separate towns entirely controlled by the NKVD, where labor was required. They were still slave labor settlements, but the refugees were mostly by themselves. They were not in prison camps, and in many cases, they weren't even fenced in any way because their settlements were so distant from any other civilization. On arrival, they were told that they would never be released. These shoemakers, homemakers, lawyers, musicians were sorted into brigades and informed that they would only be fed if they produced a required daily norm of labor. The labor was often forestry, but sometimes it was mining or other difficult work. It was a shocking and traumatic situation. The lack of proper training and equipment meant that there were on-the-job accidents leading to maiming and death. Others began to slowly starve, unable to complete their norms. The children and the elderly were the most vulnerable. The NKVD oversaw all aspects of their lives, making religious or cultural practices nearly impossible. At that moment, in 1940, it looked as though they had made a terrible mistake. Indeed, refugees in special settlements began to receive food and clothing packages from their relatives under Nazi occupation in ghettos. But even with this help, they were weakening due to vitamin deficiency, malnutrition, and inhumane conditions. They all described the meager food supplies, the enormous and vicious insects, the infections that wouldn't heal, the loss of teeth, of vision. Winter is another common theme. It was beyond anything they could have imagined. And yet they had to keep working, even in their already patched summer garments. Many family members buried their loved ones deep in the Soviet taiga, and all began to despair of surviving. Then, quite unexpectedly, at least for citizens fed on Soviet propaganda, in the summer of 1941, Germany and its allies invaded the USSR. Stalin was woefully unprepared for the German invasion. The Soviets began to lose enormous swaths of territory and soldiers. Out of desperation, Stalin came to the negotiating table with the United Kingdom. One of the compromises Churchill was able to wrangle out of Stalin was an agreement to a blanket amnesty for all Polish citizens. Thus, in the late summer of 1941, the starving Polish Jewish laborers in Soviet special settlements suddenly received the news that they were free. Although the regulations should have granted them back pay and train tickets, most received nothing but their freedom. They had to decide where to go and how to get there. Most elected to go south. They were exhausted from the cold, and they hoped that the better climate might also mean more access to foods. Additionally, as more and more released Polish citizens headed south towards Soviet Central Asia, there was incentive to follow. They could not go home where the war raged, but at least they could be with others in a similar situation. And thus began the next phase of the refugees' wartime experience. After slowly managing to reach the Central Asian republics, chiefly the Uzbek and Kazakh SSR, but also the Tajik, Turkmen, and other neighboring areas, they had to start from scratch once again. This time, they were not only in foreign territory, but also in the midst of a major war. In existential peril, the Soviets were sending all medical supplies and nutritional resources to the front. Meanwhile, the Soviet population was also on the move, as millions evacuated, either officially or on their own, ahead of the Germans and their collaborators. Most of these displaced Soviet citizens, also moved toward Central Asia. These republics, already under-resourced and with little infrastructure, were dreadfully ill-equipped to handle the surge in population. The refugees, lacking the connections and know-how of Soviet citizens, and on the bottom of the heap in terms of aid, suffered greatly. Many regretted their decision to leave the special settlements. At least they had shelter there. At least there was a way to earn food. Here, they slept in train stations, easy prey to the class of thieves who stole valuables and even shoes from sleeping victims. Additionally, overcrowding and warmer conditions led to the outbreak of contagious diseases. Even families that had managed to remain intact throughout the experience of deportation and forced labor began to lose members. This photo on the bottom left is of the Eisen family with the grave of the patriarch of their family buried in Central Asia. The first year was the hardest. Eventually, most of the refugees managed to find some kind of work and shelter. This frequently required several moves before a suitable location could be found. Their plight was also helped by the gradual improvement in Soviet conditions. The state began to reassert control and provide better access to resources. As the Soviets finally turned the tide of the war in late 1942 and early 1943, morale also improved significantly. But even with better oversight and conditions, the Soviet system was not able to replicate the level of supervision that had existed before the war. This meant that even as the military was fighting for its life and Soviet citizens under Axis occupation lived in terror, those fortunate enough to be in the interior were actually experiencing a period of relative loosening of strictures. For the Polish Jews, this modicum of freedom afforded a return to religious practice that had not been feasible in the special settlements. The photo on the top left shows a group of refugees, Polish Jewish refugees, making matzah. And they're doing so in public. They're smiling. They're not hiding what they're doing. We also see on the bottom right a school group. It's a Polish school. You can see Buchara, Warszawa. So a Polish school for Polish children in Buchara. And there's Polish, that is Catholic Polish and Jewish Polish children there. So schools were also allowed to open, even in the Polish language. The Soviets also began to allow letters and packages from abroad. Before the war, receiving a letter from a relative outside the USSR could lead to arrest. Now the Soviets needed help feeding and clothing their people. Groups across the world, but particularly the JDC, the American Joint Distribution Committee, organized aid to the beleaguered Polish Jews in the USSR. And you see on the top right, a group of packages getting ready. It's in the back of a truck it's about to be trucked from Palestine overland to Iran, and then across the Caspian Sea by boat into the Soviet Union. And what's interesting here to note is that there are both the large packages of goods that will be just distributed to anyone, but also the smaller packages, which are from families. Families in Palestine had the opportunity, if they knew the name and the address of their relatives, to actually cluster those together with the JDC larger packages and send them to their relatives. As conditions improved for the refugees and they began to imagine the end of the war, they also pondered their future. Would they be allowed to leave the USSR? What would they find on their return? News of the war and of the Holocaust filtered in, but in a piecemeal fashion. They heard rumors of individual massacres, of death, and of German bestiality, but they didn't know how much to believe. In some cases, Polish Jews serving in the Red Army liberated parts of Eastern Europe, and they sent letters back to the Soviet interior, to their relatives and friends. But still, it was a partial picture. When the war ended, the Polish Jews began to send missives to their hometowns, seeking contact with loved ones. When they didn't receive responses, they wrote again, assuming that their relatives had been forced to relocate but would soon return home. Even when they found out from neighbors living in their homes that their parents had been deported and died, they could not grasp the scope of the destruction. This would only come with repatriation. In 1946, Stalin decided to let the Polish citizens return to the newly forming post-war Polish state. There's been a lot of speculation about why he made that decision, and no one really knows for sure, but it was a great relief to the refugees to finally have the possibility of returning to their homes. This photograph shows the Yermush family, along with some others, ready to board a Polish train for repatriation. The return to Poland occasioned a number of important realizations. Firstly, the refugees faced the reality of the war and the Holocaust. Poland was devastated, and the Jews, of course, had been murdered en masse. Their families, their homes, their communities, and their entire civilization were gone. This was a great deal to take in. Moreover, the borders of the state had changed. The Soviets refused to return the annexed territories, but compensated the Poles with a roughly equal-sized chunk of German land. So this traumatized and cobbled together reborn Poland would also be communist. As if that was not enough, the refugees also began to realize that their countrymen were not pleased by their return. Poland had been anti-Semitic before the war, but the level of hatred that they experienced on their return shocked the repatriates. The combination of all of these factors led to yet another decision point. Where should they rebuild their lives? Should they stay in Poland and seek to rebuild some semblance of what they had before? The photo on the top left shows a man holding 2 Yiddish newspapers. This is in Lower Silesia in post-war Poland. Here is an attempt to capture some of that vibrancy of pre-war Polish Jewish life. And yet his colleague, you'll see, is holding a gun, demonstrating the fraught nature of their efforts. Below them is a wedding photo. The groom in his Red Army uniform, a Polish Jew newly returned from the Soviet Union. The bride spent the war in Poland and was the sole survivor of her family. Back in Poland after the war, the small Jewish community, about 250,000 at its height, included both survivors who stayed in Poland and returnees. Many times they sought to rebuild Jewish life together. Some stayed in Poland, but over time, more and more left. They moved to DP camps, like these 2 girls you see on the top. Camp administrators note that only the repatriates had intact families and young to teenage age children. Survivors had older teens were sometimes able to survive the war, but no one the age of these girls on the whole. And from the DP camps, the refugees and the survivors together sought new lives abroad. And the yellowed photograph shows a mixed group of Polish Jews, including repatriates on the Exodus. We typically associate all of these post-war photos here with Holocaust survival, which brings me to my final topic for today, which is memory. Part of what drew me to this story in the first place, and I should just mention here that this is the most superficial version of the story. There's so many twists and turns that I could not possibly include, and that those of you who know something about this experience from your family stories will recognize, whole sections that had to be cut out in order to make it somewhat comprehensible. And just to give the skeletal version. But part of why I wanted to tell this story in the first place is that it is so much a part of the war and the Holocaust, and yet also apart from it. The Polish Jewish refugees began World War II and ended after the war as part of the Polish Jewish community. They experienced the German invasion. They faced the same decisions as other Polish Jews, but their anomalous choices placed them outside of Hitler's reach and also outside of the frame of the war and its history and memory. Even when they returned and they joined their landsmen in Poland, in DP camps, and elsewhere around the world, they were part of the refugee population. And yet, as the status of survivors began to rise in the Western world, they didn't quite have that identity. They weren't quite accepted as survivors, Holocaust survivors. And just as Jews have not entirely accepted the refugees or really shown much curiosity and interest in their experience, so too they have largely been excluded from Soviet and Polish memory of the war. The statue that is pictured here is one that was erected in Warsaw in 1995 in memory of the Polish citizens who died in Soviet captivity during the war. Amidst the many Catholic crosses, you'll see stands a lone Jewish tombstone. So on the one hand, the creators of this monument recognized that Jews were among the Poles who suffered at Soviet hands. On the other hand, the whole tone of this monument is somber. For ethnic Poles, Soviet occupation and deportation was an unmitigated disaster on equal footing with what happened under German occupation. Yet for Polish Jews, despite very real hardships, this is a story of survival. If there were to be a Jewish monument to this experience, it would look very different. I hope through this book to encourage greater knowledge of and engagement with both the history and the memory of this war experience, this adjacent Holocaust experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eliyana, for a really terrific, clear talk. Before we jump into questions, can I ask you just to stop sharing your screen, and then we'll be able to see one another much better?
Yes, of course. Thank you.
So thank you for, as always, telling what is a very complex story in such an engaging and clear way. And I would just recommend, again, to those of you who would be interested, Eliyana's book is as clear as her talk was just now and contains a lot of those twists and turns. And I posted in the chat a little earlier a link to Blackwell's, which currently has a 25% discount on the book. But just also to say thanks, Eliyana, for such important work that you have done in excavating the story, which, as you say, has been so marginalized in the historiography, even though what we're talking about is really not an insubstantial group of people. And something that I was struck by both in your talk just now and also in reading the book was the the really excellent job you do of foregrounding the voices and the experiences of the victims themselves throughout, and really making clear the diversity of responses. This is not a simple story. It's a very complex and rich story. So thank you. We already have some questions that are coming through in the chat, and I see Bernard has his hand up. So Bernard, do you want to go ahead and ask your question, and I'll start going through those in the chat?
Thank you very much for an excellent lecture. One of the well-known characters was involved in this migration to the Soviet interior was, of course, the former late Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. Now, he was forcibly transported from Vilna in the Kishki prison to Siberia, which forms the base of his memoir. I think it's called Night or Black Night or something.
White Nights.
White Nights. Yes, White Nights. Now, to what extent was the migration into the interior of the Soviet Union anti-Semitic directed deportations of Menachem Begin's experience was, or was it a mere panic-stricken exodus from Nazi invasion?
Great. Yes. Yeah. You're quite right that there are a number of very famous individuals who were part of this deportation, migration, whatever exactly we want to call it. So Menachem Begin's experience was different because he was a prominent political person. So he was deported not with the refugees, although he was a refugee himself from Warsaw, and he and his wife had escaped to Vilna. But he was deported earlier with a group of political deportees and therefore was sent to a prison camp rather than a special settlement. But his group of deportees, he was deported because of his leadership in Beitar, but in his train of deportees were Polish political leaders from the left and the right. That is, his political enemies were on his train. He wasn't deported for anti-Semitic reasons. Once he got to the camp, he certainly describes facing various forms of anti-Semitism. But part of what's fascinating to me about the Soviet experience, and probably its most important distinction from the German experience, from the Jewish perspective, is that the Jews weren't treated worse than anyone else. They were treated the same as other Polish citizens. They faced the same trials, and sometimes there was social anti-Semitism, but there was not state-sponsored anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union during this period against the Jews.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. So we have a question in the chat from Andrew Sorchenko, who says, thank you for such a wonderful overview. My understanding is that the Soviets did keep good records of who they transferred and where. Our families are only one of many populations transferred during the war. I believe my mother was initially deported to a settlement called Teguldit in Siberia. I believe her parents may be buried there. There is no record that I can find of a camp. How could I go about finding more? Are there NKVD records regarding the population transfers from the USSR to Poland that can be searched?
Oh, thank you for asking. This is a question that I get versions of a lot, and it's a very painful one because I have to give a disappointing answer again and again. It was disappointing for me as an academic that I couldn't get a hold of these records, but so much more so for you, who this is your family's story. The fact is that Russia and the other FSU states will not allow access to these files. And it's not because they're afraid of this story getting out. It's because of what is mixed in with it. In fact, this is in many ways a good story because the Jews survived. And this, I've tried to argue this with archivists before. But yes, they did keep good records, and we simply cannot get at those. Some of the early deportation records from Ukraine, if you know the city and town from which your family was deported, you can write to certain archives with your family name and sometimes get access to that information, but it's not that easy, and they don't always answer, and they don't have that much money, and it's better if you pay someone to go and do it for you, but then they have to prove that they have your right as a family member. But the camp records, the actual records from the special settlements, we can't get a hold of. we have the repatriation records we do have, because that was, those were under Polish supervision. And the Polish government in exile tried to reconstruct some of the lists of who was in which special settlement and camp. And some of that is in London at the Sikorsky Archives, and some of it is at the Hoover Institute in Palo Alto, but it is incomplete. And I don't think this is going to change, and I'm sorry about it.
Eliyana, could you say a little bit more about the memorialization? I'm fascinated by not just the story itself, but also where it fits into the larger, not just historiography of the Holocaust, but I suppose also public perceptions of and understandings of where it fits into the story. You know, this idea that these aren't real survivors, that this wasn't the real experience, and how restoring some of this story might change or reshape how we think about the Holocaust and how we think about those events. What kinds of different angles might it allow us?
Yeah, thank you. This is something I've obviously done a lot of thinking about. And when I started this project, I wanted to answer the question, essentially, are they Holocaust survivors? And I wanted to say yes. But in the course of doing the research, I began to understand that it doesn't really matter. It's a construct. It's just a word. It's an idea. What matters is that we honor their story and their experiences and figure out how to talk about it and how to memorialize it. And part of that is about sort of how to tell the story of the Holocaust, because somehow we've created a story that has these certain borders, geographical and somewhat ideological, that it just cuts off. And so in a lot of Holocaust history books, you'll note, and you notice once you know more about the story, you see it there, even if you didn't see it before, that the historians will say, oh, and some people fled eastward. But then that's the last of them. They just disappear from the story. They're gone. And then at the end, sometimes when you get to the DP camps, it'll say, oh yeah, and some of these people were actually in the Soviet Union. But what happened to them there? It's like it's not, nobody cares. And so I decided, I mean, for me, it matters less whether these people are quote unquote Holocaust survivors. They're certainly war refugees. They're certainly survivors of the war. They had a very distinct and important experience. And I think we need to figure out how to talk about it, how to commemorate it, how to include it in our history and memory. And there have been some more and less successful attempts. And one of the interesting ones, I think, as an example of where they are included, actually, is in many Yiskerbücher, in memorial books. Actually, everyone got to send in their stories. They're edited, but there's a lot there. And so right alongside the Holocaust testimonies, sometimes you see these testimonies mixed together. This was what happened to everybody from this village. And so when you come from a local perspective, in some ways, you tell the whole story. And so that's perhaps one answer is on a local level to look at this. But there have to be other ways also that we can honor this story.
That's fascinating about the Yiskerbücher. And I do think that, you know, the work that you do in the book, it does seem to me it's clearly a work of very meticulous and rigorous historical research, but also in foregrounding their voices. It felt to me very much like a memorialization too. On what we were just talking about, Claire commented in the chat that she's been to the Polin Museum in Warsaw, but can't recall any information about those Polish refugees. Is that right, that they're not included in that narrative?
It's and like most museums, there's a couple of quotes on the wall in Polin from these people. That is their decisions about leaving, for example. But we don't really hear about them. So even though that is in some ways the most up-to-date, cutting-edge depiction, it's still not there. And that's frustrating because in Warsaw, of all places, they know about this story. And you would have thought they could have done a better job of including it, but it does involve rethinking what the Holocaust is exactly.
Mm. Related to all of this, Yecheskel asks in the chat, is it safe to assume that the overwhelming number of Polish Jews who survived the war were those who were deported or fled into the Soviet Union?
Yes, and I didn't put a lot of numbers in my talk because they're a little mind-numbing, but basically, of the 250,000 or so survivors of Polish Jewry, about 70% of them survived in the Soviet Union, in the unoccupied realms. And obviously Polish Jewry, I mean, they're also the people who wrote the first studies of the Holocaust, right? And many of them were themselves in the Soviet Union. So it started very early. People like Trunk and Eisenbach, for those of you who've read some of those histories, they were in the Soviet Union during the war, and yet they came back and wrote about the Holocaust.
That's really fascinating. I mean, it's wonderful. One of the chapters in Eliyana's book is titled Jewish Luck, and it's this wonderful, sardonic turn, but it's certainly the way we always told the story of my grandparents, well, they survived in the Gulag, but it was better than being in Auschwitz, that you had that luck. But as you say, it was the majority of Polish Jews who survived were there. So, and it is an extraordinary story to rescue. Claire asks, is there a similar attitude towards German Jews who went further east to Shanghai, for example? The kind of exclusion, I assume, Claire, that you mean the exclusion of them from the narrative.
I would say yes and no. So yeah, one option, and again, when I thought about sort of how to place this story, would be just to call it a refugee story and to put it in that category, because there are so many groups of refugees. And we have been in recent years recovering some of them. There's a recent book about Jewish refugees in Portugal during the war. So it fits there. And in some ways it is like those stories. And in fact, I should possibly mention that that's part of this story also. That is, some of these Polish Jews got into Lithuania before the Soviets took over Lithuania and got to Shanghai. And so they're all the same people, not all of them, but there are German and other Central European Jews also. On the other hand, though, I do see this story as different in that it wasn't clear that the Germans weren't going to reach them. They were still in a different kind of danger than Jews who made it to South America or Shanghai were. The Germans were taking over unbelievable amounts of Soviet territory. The fact that they got stopped at Stalingrad, it could have happened later, it could have not happened at all. And there are some people among this group who fled more than once. That is, first they fled in 1939, then they stayed in the newly annexed territories, and they had to flee again in 1941. There's some people who fled 3 times. That is, they fled to the Caucasus, and then they had to flee again in 1942 from the Germans. So there's a contingency here, which isn't the same, to my mind, as some of these other groups of refugees.
So I have another question here in the chat, which is about Jews in DP camps, referring to a book called The Last Million by David Nassau, which implies that the returning Jews remained in DP camps for years because they were suspected as being collaborators. I'm not familiar with that book, but Gladwin wonders whether that was your finding.
I'm also not familiar with that book, so I can't speak to that particular argument, but it's certainly the case that the DPs had a very difficult time finding countries that would take them in. The Yishuv in Palestine would have been happy to do so, but were blocked for a while, as you all well know, by the British authorities. And then eventually there was the State of Israel. But many countries wouldn't take them in. It is less, in the case of the people who I've read about, their issue was not with being accused of collaboration, but of being accused of being communists. That is, they, in many cases, and I have documented a few of them and others I've only heard about, people lied and said they were Holocaust survivors, not because there was more status, because in 1949 there wasn't more status if you were in a camp or you were in the Soviet Union. but because they couldn't get into the United States because of the Red Scare. And there's a journalist, David Berger, who writes that, right? He puts that in his book. He admits to it. But in other cases, people have told me and have asked me to be quiet and not use their names. I even had a colleague, a historian, who showed me her family's documents, but wouldn't allow me to publish them because her father still thinks he might be deported, which is not really going to happen. But it speaks of the, the fear engendered by that era.
Fascinating. So I wonder whether, as a last question, I can come back to, well, you mentioned the Jiskebücher, and I'm fascinated by the Jiskebücher. These are the memorial books that were created by survivors about their hometowns. Is that a good way of describing them? A kind of nostalgic, an exercise of nostalgia and history writing to preserve the history. And I noticed that your next book, or the book that you're currently working on, is about Jiskebücher. Is that right? I wondered if I could ask you to tell us just a little bit about that, a little bit of a sneak preview.
Oh, sure, I'd be happy to. I'm still figuring it out. That's the short answer. I was starting a research fellowship last spring when Yad Vashem closed down, and so I didn't get to do any research and had to come home. But I have always been fascinated by Jiskebücher, but in the course of this project of writing about the Polish Jews, I became quite interested in sort of how they tell history and which history they tell. And there's not a single narrative, because that's their polyvocal text. That's part of the beauty of them. But I would like to write about the history of Jiskebücher, how they came about, sort of who was in charge, and the changes over time, how they came from, because originally the very first memorial books are memorial books. They're just necrologies, they're lists of names. But then suddenly, by the 1960s, they're 5,000 page books with photographs and recipes and stories, and everything is there. There's nothing that isn't there about those hometowns. And so I'm interested in that development and hoping to find out more.
Wonderful. Well, I find them totally fascinating too. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about what you find out. On that note, though, and as it is 8 o'clock, I'm going to finish here. And thank you so much again, Eliyana, on behalf of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Center, for taking the time to be with us, to talk to us today. That was really terrific. A reminder that you can buy Eliyana's book at all good bookstores, and especially at Blackwell's, for a 25% discount. A reminder also about an event that we will be holding next week. This is the third in our Churchill Conversation series, which we're holding in partnership with the International Churchill Society and the Churchill Archive Centre. And that's going to be looking at Churchill's views on the European Union and the role that he envisaged for Great Britain. So that's a nice topical one. That's next Tuesday, the 13th of April at 5 p.m. UK time. It's also free, promises to be excellent. So please do register to book your place. You can find that on our website. And apart from that, thank you all again for being here. Thank you again, Eliyana, and hope to see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Eliyana.